So I just wanted to begin to say this is a long time coming. We've been more, if you remember, we started this journey about a year or so ago, and it's not ending here, but talking about equity and the revenue fund. We took a presentation to the HHS committee. The board of supervisors funded an equity study, and we hired HRNA, of which Stan is the named partner. I always get this wrong. Partner. What's your title? Managing partner. Thank you. I don't want to give you the motion, of which Stan is a managing partner. And so again, like the conversation surrounding RecPac and Camp Fairfax, this was also a very iterative, collaborative process, which is why we're graced with Carla who was our equity officer. And so the way we're gonna Stan's gonna go over the equity study, the results from the equity study, but we thought we'd frame it a little bit and invite Carla to sort of talk about a little bit of how we got to where we are. So turn it over to Carla.
Good evening, everyone. They've already introduced me, but I'm really excited to be here. I've been in my role of Chief Deputy Officer in the county now for about 5.5 years. And when I've been here before to talk to the board about the concepts of equity, but it's really now about sort of where do we see inequity and where are we actively addressing it and where are we aligning and adjusting our systems and strategies to eliminate inequity, and which departments, are doing that work. And so I just want to first start by saying I am very thankful for the leadership and the overall leadership of the Park Authority in terms of, taking that charge to become one Fairfax and really, investigating and interrogating and thinking about the work of the organization and the outcomes that you all seek to achieve from an equity perspective. When we do this work, we definitely want to look at things that need to change and sort of where we want to be. So, I talk about the principles are you start by saying, are we fine with our current structural arrangements? Are we okay with our current outcomes? Are our systems working the way that we want them to? And if not, where can we make change? But in order to make that change, we have to start with a look at history and figure out how we got to the situation, as well as to look at the root causes of which generating the change, right? Because we can see a change, but we don't necessarily know what's driving that change. And one of the things that's been just really enlightening about the work we've been doing is that we took that time to look at history. And there's a slide before you, and I won't go through each of these points, but we just have to be frank about how our systems came to be. And so a lot of the development of the county overall and the creation of the systems that we are responsible for managing now, the time period in which they were evolving was a time when in our country and in our community, there was a couple of things happening. One, there was, this move to segregate, and that, communities were segregated, resources were segregated, people were segregated. And so our systems were created during that time. The other thing to think about is who was participating in the process of creating these things. It wasn't necessarily an inclusive process. And so the people who were doing the planning and making the decisions were making decisions not necessarily taking into account the interests of all people. And so one of the things that's striking and that we, sort of found evidence of in our research really lines up with the national history that we know. That, there were facilities in the Park Authority that were segregated. There were you know, how certain park authority spaces came to be was because certain communities were being evacuated, right? They were being displaced. And so it's a very complicated history. We're not going to go into it tonight, but what it tells us is that the system was created on a certain set of values. Do we still hold those values today? And I would say, from my experience and what the evidence is that I see, is that we don't. And so if the system is producing results based on being created during a time period that just is inconsistent with where we are today, then we should do some of that unpacking. And I think, you know, what we've done by doing this historical look is that we, you know, we've seen sort of how some of these things get created. There was a real intersecting, you know, the previous presentation related to the transition of RecPac, you know, really speaks to the continuingly intersecting relationship between the park authority and what is now neighborhood and community services. So I'm a former employee of neighborhood and community services. So it was once community and recreation services, it was once recreation and community services. And a lot of their, and as you all know, it is still considered a human services agency. It is not by outcome focused on recreation. What they were put in place to do was to basically serve the needs of the marginalized, whoever the marginalized happened to be, whether that was at one period, Black people, because again, in Fairfax County, we were very distinct Black and white population. That has evolved over time. So the people of color or poor people, you know, that was intended to be structured that way. So that's why they're sort of their general fund business model is very much situated on that's what they were in place for. And because for those of you who don't know, my background is recreation. By training a recreation therapist. And so one of the things about that background that I learned is, you know, how recreation evolved, you know, just the idea of recreating and who could recreate. So most poor people didn't have time to recreate, right? And so it was more sort of taking care of a problem, you know, that sort of keeping people occupied was sort of the focus of that work over time or initially. And a lot of the programming of the park authority was beyond just the park piece, but the programming was really for people who could pay. And that's very consistent with, you know, nationally, just the themes of recreation. And so as you look across the history and you take into consideration, you know, this, you know, the history of segregation in the nation and in our community, and then you weave in the evolution of our thinking about recreation, you sort of end up in this place of here's where we are now, right? And we have to unpack that, again, get to the root causes of the types of problems that we're seeing because of what this system is producing. And I think what the Park Authority has worked on with the consultant, the Department of staff are working with the consultant, and with the input from us and from, you know, others, is I think a great example for the rest of the county about really getting to what's going to work and what is aligned to our values moving forward. So with that,
I go to the next, just flip the next. So what we did was, just so you, and this is not to go through, but into the record and everybody can look through, we went through from the origins through. So I encourage you all to sort of read through what Carla was describing. One of the main points that I just wanted to make that I think it's misunderstood a lot of times is that's 2 pages of FCPA history before the first rec centers were built. It's really important to note that we existed and we were created as an authority to protect parkland. And what we weren't necessarily created for the revenue fund evolved, it wasn't established until 1982, where we made that first tranche of rec centers. And the next slide.
And again, that was during that period of time when you paid for those things, right? That if people want them, you pay.
Well, but wasn't that also done because the Board of Supervisors didn't want, my understanding is that we have rec centers because the school system wanted to put pools at the schools, at the high schools. And they said, we're not giving those to you, but the park authority could do it. And the park authority said, they're money
That's
pits,
right
right?
there.
Okay.
So in 1979 to 82, they decided to have swimming. And so the school board, the schools, the county decided to add pools, but they wanted them rightfully so to be community amenities. And so as was the case in the 80s, with government, it was make government work for you. So we're gonna make this huge investment, which was as we all know, because they're now all up for replacement. So it's a huge investment of 5 rec centers within 5 years that they built, and they sold it on the whole. Don't worry, that's the only investment. It'll pay for themselves. And so that was fine. And then next slide. Then the revenue fund was created, and then the recessions in the 90s, the recession in 08, a lot of things shifted over, and that's how we got to this indirect cost that we're gonna be talking a little about. And then I have the last couple slides about sort of NCS's movement. So what's kind of been happening is because of the revenue fund and the structure that Stan's gonna talk about and who we're serving, we have continue to shift in this one direction. And now that more people are recreating and it's more of a natural, everybody, no matter what your demographic, what your age wants to recreate, there is this huge vacuum. And if you go to the next slide, it's this huge vacuum that really other entities have now had to come in to fill. That's why you get this sort of, to be quite, Providence Rec Center, Sully Rec Center, that's not, Community Center, Providence Community Center, Sully Community Center, that's not what NCS was created to do, but it's a need that the community wants because they want to be able to use a gym for free. They want to have community rooms. And because Park Authority our revenue fund has not created that space where we can fill that gap. Libraries have yoga, and fitness classes, free fitness classes. The other entities are going in to fill that space. So a lot of this work that we're doing is trying to right that ship so that we can sort of get back into our really great lanes and be able, there's no reason why we can't have yoga classes in libraries and we can't be doing stuff in community centers because we're the recreation. That's
And the thing about, in terms of the latest 2 community centers, the original community centers were schools that were vacated when schools were desegregated, right? And so those schools went to the community and turned into community centers, and that's what NCS managed. They actually initially went to the community themselves. So there were community organizations that ran those, and then eventually that arrangements were made that those would become county. And so, these latest 2 are the result of proffers, frankly. And so, again, I think this is one part of the conversation, what you all talked about earlier is another part of the conversation. There will be other parts of the conversation to just think about how do we best meet the needs of the county aligned to our current values. And so, again, I think that the plan that's been developed is really intended to address that.
okay. We can go right into Stan.
Again, thank you to the Parks Board, to Jay and the team for engaging HRNA to support this effort here in the county. As background, HRNA is a national expert on parks and open space, including funding strategies, evaluating, and designing for equity. We also have quite a bit of experience here in Fairfax County, working on a number of issues from housing to market studies in different parts of the county, supporting economic recovery coming out of COVID, as well as looking at supporting the ongoing transformation of Tyson's. We were engaged to help the Park Authority support its efforts to better serve its population, as Carla has just laid out. We all know the importance of parks, recreation, and open space. These benefits were made even more clear during the COVID-19 pandemic. Parks provide exercise opportunities, mental health benefits, childcare, community gathering space, and social cohesion. They also provide economic benefits. They're an important part of making Fairfax an attractive place to live, to work, play, and ensuring that we continue to attract employers and residents that grow the county's tax base. Parks and recreation are also public goods. Much like our school system and our libraries, we need to make sure that everyone who lives in Fairfax has equal access to our top tier system and the benefits that participation provides. We've seen these graphs before, but we can see quite clearly that Fairfax isn't serving its residents equally. 71% of summer camp families earn over $150,000 a year, whereas only 40% of the Fairfax population falls in that highest income bracket. The county population is 50% white, but rec center members are 79% white. And we can see a hint of the context behind these numbers in the bars on the far right. RecPac, which is not operated out of the revenue fund, is therefore much more affordable and able to serve a different slice of the county's population. And that really underscores the fact that having such a large portion of the Park Authority's budget relying on fees and charges means that fees need to be high enough to support expenses that continue to grow every year. These high fees make many programs unaffordable and therefore inaccessible to a large portion of the population, and it hampers the Park Authority's ability to provide equitable services. I want to return to the idea of parks and recreation as a public good and all the benefits they provide. The Park Authority's funding model diverges from most of your peers and from best practice in that you do not currently consider community benefits when setting cost recovery targets. For example, you might expect that an individual Pilates session or renting out space for a private birthday party, the residents would pay full cost for that. But an after-school youth rec program where kids can be in a safe environment and learn new skills, kids swim lessons, where kids can benefit from health and safety. Residents are also asked to pay the full cost of those programs as well. And as we discuss in the next slide, we're actually asking folks to pay more than the full cost of these programs. So now I want to talk a little bit more about why such a large percentage of the Park Authority's budget comes from fees and charges, and why your funding model forces these really high charges. As these models were put in place in a different time period to address specific revenue concerns, we're now realizing that they don't align with the county's values. Park Authority's revenue fund works differently than most other places, and that 100% cost recovery requirement applies to both covering direct program costs, like the camp counselor's salary, or the basketballs, as well as indirect costs, like paper towels in the rec center restrooms, a computer in the offices, and the graphic designer to print out a flyer. Many of these expenses represent what is necessary to even say that Fairfax County has a public recreation system, that we can open the doors at the rec center, even if we don't have any programming. And we're required to have all of that covered by our fees and charges. This is really why fees are so high. Other agencies are fairly rarely required to recoup these indirect costs. And these policies were put in place, again, in a different time period to address specific concerns, but we're now realizing that these do not fully serve the residents of the county. Together, the fact that we ignore community benefits in many of our programs and we need to cover indirect costs, both of which are out of line with best practices, is what's making our fees so high. As you can see in these charts, 59% cost recovery looks really different than other agencies that represent larger populations at 17% cost recovery, and the median of all agencies at 25% cost recovery.
I'm sorry, can you go back to that slide for a second? It just takes a minute to, no, can you go back? I'm sorry.
Allison.
Okay. Sorry, I was just trying to catch up on seeing it for the first time and understanding it. So the 22% under FCPA, that's the indirect cost that was referred to in the other graphic.
Are you implying there that NCS does not have to pay an indirect, does not have indirect cost recovery?
Correct. Yeah, because of the way it's set up as not a separate authority. And then is the median agency, you have the population over 250,000. Is that,
Larger jurisdiction.
I was gonna say, that's the largest, I assume, of the, yeah. Sorry, thank you.
When we think about implementing best practices to ensure equity, there are a number of key recommendations. First, implementing a cost recovery pyramid that will reduce programs for everyone, regardless of their income, in recognition of the public benefits that those services provide. Second, introducing supplementary subsidies to help lower income families attend all of our programs. Because we don't want to create a system where only wealthy kids can join the youth sports clinic that is getting less subsidy. If Fairfax Parks were to target the national median of 25% cost recovery across these recommendations, that would represent a revenue gap of approximately $32.4 million. We recognize that with all of the services that Parks Authority offers, in unique context here in Fairfax, Perhaps a 25% cost recovery isn't necessarily the goal for you all. With a targeted approach to the cost recovery pyramid, we think you can rein in fees and make these services and these benefits more accessible to all of your residents. On this slide, we can see what the cost recovery pyramid might look like in Fairfax specifically. Personal training and retail sales would remain in the top tier, while items like general admission to rec centers might target 20 to 30% cost recovery. And things like the summer concert series, which is so important to the community, would be free. Fairfax Parks is still working through what this would look like for you all, but the Parks Authority is proposing a modified implementation based on core areas with significant community benefits and health benefits, such as camps and swim lessons. There would still be public engagement process to determine final categories and tiers. The Park Authority estimates that this modified pyramid cost approximately $9.4 million to implement. Another important part of these recommendations.
I'm sorry, when you say the $9.4 million cost, that's the revenue that would have to be made up,
By adjusting the
right? But that's in theory the outstanding new balance that we would need somebody across the street to. Okay.
Another important part of the recommendations is implementing supplementary subsidy programs that further help make our programs affordable. A sliding fee scale would recognize that even if a summer camp is only a 30% cost recovery, it still might be too expensive for some families. And a flexible annual voucher for low-income families will help ensure that certain residents aren't excluded from more individual benefit services like renting a picnic shelter. Administering these programs is quite costly and require coordination with other agencies that operate similar programs like the SAC. Sliding fee scales offer a range of financial support across income distribution, allowing agencies to provide services at unsubsidized and less subsidized rates for the highest income households, while preserving affordability for low to middle income households. Program-based sliding fee scales can be adjusted to align with the program's community versus individual benefit. Sliding fee scales are a resource incentive to administer, as eligibility is not binary and requires verification of income. The Park Authority will likely require additional resources in partnership with other Fairfax agencies to administer a fee scale, as it's already been done for RecPAC and for SAC. The Park Authority estimates it would cost approximately $7 million to make a sliding fee scale available for summer camps, swim classes, and rec center access, but this might change after community input. Flexible annual voucher for low-income families will help ensure that even programs with high individual benefit that might not otherwise be subsidized can still be accessed by low-income families. The way this usually works in other places, such as Reston, is that there's a defined annual voucher amount for eligible low-income families, typically $200 to $1,000. There's a nominal entrance fee or co-payment per program to ensure attendance. And again, because these programs are expensive to administer, participation is also tied to eligibility for other income verified programs, such as free school lunch or disability payments. The Park Authority estimates that flexible annual voucher program would cost approximately $3 million, but the exact amount might vary based on need and uptake of this program. Finally, underlying all of these recommendations is the cost of administration and outreach, which is critical to the success of any program. The Park Authority must build out the infrastructure to actually implement these programs and conduct significant outreach to make sure to engage the communities that haven't historically been users of recreation and programming. The Park Authority estimates $7.2 million for administration, software, and outreach costs to support these efforts. So in total, the Park Authority estimates they would need approximately $26.6 million in additional annual funding to implement a modified version of the recommendations. And these amounts, again, might slip slightly since they were estimated prior to extensive community and public engagement the Park Authority is planning. And again, I want to underscore that the last administration and outreach cost is really necessary to make sure that these programs and recommendations can be implemented. To wrap up, we've talked about the necessity to reduce fees and charges to improve equity outcomes. And in doing so, the Park Authority will need an additional $26.6 million in additional public funding, which is less than the $34.2 million would have cost to achieve 25% cost recovery of the FITS peers. There may be other small sources of revenue that we can explore, philanthropic sources as an example, but those other sources will definitely not be enough to fill the gap. Increasing public funding for recreation will allow the park authority to reduce its fees and charges, to price programs in accordance with the community benefits, and offer additional subsidies to low-income people. If we think about why fees are so high, that they're required to cover both direct and indirect costs or indirect expenses in the revenue fund. If we reduce fees and change the structure of the cost recovery requirement, that does require additional revenue from another source. The good news is that many other places have dedicated tax streams for parks and recreation, whether property tax levies or other creative funding streams, and these measures consistently have high levels of voter support. I want to conclude with a reminder and discussion of what our goals are. We really want to make progress toward equity and make progress toward a public recreation system where the users match the county's population more closely. 71% of your summer camp families are in the highest income bracket. 69% of your summer camp families are white. That's due in large part to the high fees that make recreation inaccessible. The recommendations that we made, implementing a multi-tiered pyramid of cost recovery based on community benefit, which lower the cost of critical programs for everyone, and implementing subsidy programs through a sliding fee scale and through flexible household voucher program, which provides support for low-income families, especially to access a full range of programming and high-quality programming in the county. In combination, these recommendations will make sure that fees are not a barrier to participation. Will expand access to all benefits of public recreation we talked about earlier. And together, these represent an alignment with national best practices and correct for why the park authority's fees are so high to begin with. Our hope is that these recommendations are the first steps, very important first steps, to meeting the county's equity goals. Thank you.